Elijah Williams sat comfortably in first class, a highly successful CEO accustomed to the finer things in life. He had pre-ordered his meal, lobster bisque, his usual choice. But when the flight attendant returned, wearing an apologetic expression, she informed him they were out of his dish. Something inside him snapped. What should have been a routine flight became the beginning of something far more significant. In that moment, Elijah realized it wasn't an error. It was intentional. The coldness in her tone, the dismissive shrug, the way she handed him a meager sandwich and tap water while other passengers enjoyed caviar, it was all deliberate. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't just another CEO, another passenger. He was the only black man in the cabin, and it felt glaringly obvious. This wasn't about a meal. It was about being overlooked, disrespected, and dismissed once again. Elijah Williams wasn't the kind of man to let that slide. What happened next would change everything for Skyjet Airlines and send a powerful message no one would forget. Keep watching to see how a moment of disrespect turned into a game-changing power move. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Elijah Williams, a man used to commanding boardrooms and managing multi-billion-dollar deals, never expected that his flight on Skyjet Flight 917 would become the scene of a transformation he never saw coming. Dressed in his tailored navy suit and polished loafers, Elijah moved through the first-class cabin with the quiet confidence that always accompanied him in business negotiations. The scent of fresh linen and champagne filled the air, creating the illusion of luxury that Skyjet prided itself on. As he settled into his seat, Elijah opened his tablet, diving into a merger presentation that was set to finalize the next morning in Geneva. His mind was already miles ahead, strategizing for the next major step in his company's European expansion. But despite his focus, something felt off. He could feel the soft murmur of passengers around him, the faint hum of the plane's engines reverberating through the cabin. Everything seemed as it should be, the calm atmosphere of first class where only luxury and comfort were supposed to reign. But then, the flight attendant came by, offering him the menu. Elijah barely glanced up. He had already pre-ordered his meal, as he always did, knowing exactly what he wanted. Lobster bisque, followed by filet mignon, a combination he'd grown accustomed to, a luxury that came with his position. It wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol. A reflection of the treatment he had come to expect from airlines like Skyjet, which prided itself on catering to its elite, high-paying clientele. With a slight nod, he placed the order, almost as an afterthought, then returned to his work. But the attendant's response this time felt different. She hurried off almost too quickly, a subtle urgency in her movements that didn't sit right with him. A few moments later, she returned, and the tension in her smile was palpable. "I'm sorry, sir. We're out of the luxury meal options. You'll need to choose from the regular menu," she said, her voice smooth and polite, but there was something about it that didn't feel genuine. Elijah blinked, processing her words. "Out. But I pre-ordered." Her response was as dismissive as it was casual, like it was a minor inconvenience that she brushed off without a second thought. "It must not have gone through." "Happens sometimes," she said with a shrug before turning to walk away. His jaw tightened, but his face remained impassive. What just happened? For over a decade, Elijah had been flying with Skyjet. Never before had his pre-ordered meal been overlooked, especially not in first class, where attention to detail was paramount. He stared down at his tray, a sad sandwich and lukewarm water mocking him, while the other passengers around him, all white men in tailored suits, were served with lavish plates of caviar and champagne. The contrast was stark, the injustice more glaring than he cared to admit. It wasn't just a meal. It wasn't about a small oversight or a misunderstanding. This was different. The dismissive attitude of the flight attendant, the way she brushed him off as if he didn't matter, like his status, his value, didn't deserve the same respect as the others, cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just the meal, it was the unspoken message that had been delivered loud and clear: you'll have to choose from the regular selection. Her voice was smooth, but there was something about it that didn't sit well with him. Elijah blinked, confused. Out. I pre-ordered. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained impassive. What had just happened? For over a decade, Elijah had been flying with Skyjet. Never before had his pre-ordered meal been overlooked, let alone in first class. He stared at his tray, the pathetic sandwich and lukewarm water mocking him, while the other passengers around him, all white men in tailored suits, were served with a lavish display of caviar and champagne. It wasn't just a meal. It wasn't just about a small oversight. The dismissiveness of the attendant, her body language, the way she rushed off without offering a solution. The lack of apology told him everything he needed to know. He'd been overlooked, not just as a customer, but as a person. He was the only black man in the cabin. And in that moment, he felt it more deeply than ever before. He scanned the room, his gaze locking on the other passengers. 6 men, all seated comfortably, sipping champagne and chatting. They hadn't noticed what had just happened, nor would they ever. To them, the flight was just another mundane routine. But to Elijah, this was something else. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a pattern. Elijah wasn't new to this. He had lived with this kind of disregard before. The subtle racism, the unspoken assumptions that he didn't belong in certain spaces, that he didn't deserve the same level of treatment as others. But Elijah was strategic. He didn't react impulsively. No, Elijah would make them pay for this, calmly, quietly, but decisively. For the next 10 minutes, his mind churned with a quiet fury. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random failure of service. Something had happened behind the scenes that led to this. As he tapped his fingers on the armrest, he realized he had been cast aside, reduced to someone not worth the effort. But Elijah wasn't the kind of man to let this kind of treatment go unanswered. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Marcus Brandt, his assistant. "Everything okay?" The message read. Elijah wasn't going to sit there feeling humiliated. He wasn't going to let Skyjet get away with this. He responded with a single sentence: "Initiate internal audit protocol. Flight 917. Cabin crew ID needed. Confirm when ready." It wasn't about the meal anymore. It wasn't even about the flight attendant who had dismissed him. This was about sending a message. Elijah was going to expose the culture of exclusivity, the overlooked promises, and turn it into a lesson for everyone at Skyjet. As the flight continued, Elijah remained calm, his expression unreadable. The flight attendants went about their duties, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. They were too busy serving drinks and chatting with the other passengers, paying no attention to the man who had been made to feel invisible. But Elijah had already set his plan in motion. By the time the plane landed in Geneva, everything would change. If you are enjoying this story, like and subscribe for more stories like this. Marcus Brandt, Elijah's ever-vigilant assistant, was already deep into the airline's employee records. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, pulling up the personnel files of the flight attendants on board. He knew Elijah's requests weren't casual. Everything had a purpose. He accessed the records, confirming his suspicions about the staff's behavior. The flight attendant who had denied Elijah his meal had a history of complaints, discriminatory remarks, rude behavior, even passive-aggressive comments about prioritizing certain guests. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. In the corporate world, the smallest act of disrespect could cause ripples. For Elijah, it was never just about getting even. It was about exposing the system, forcing change, and making sure no one would ever be treated this way again. Elijah tapped the service button again, this time more deliberately. When the older flight attendant approached him, there was a visible hesitation in his step, as though he already knew something had shifted. Elijah wasn't the same man who had quietly ordered his meal earlier. His voice was calm but firm as he asked for clarification on the meal issue again, his eyes never leaving the attendant's face. "I pre-ordered a luxury meal," Elijah said, his tone sharp. "And yet I've been given something else. You mentioned something about prioritizing guests. Can you explain that?" The flight attendant stammered, unable to respond before Elijah cut him off. "I understand," Elijah said. His words were deliberate, measured. "I understand completely." The flight was nearing its descent into Geneva, but Elijah was already several steps ahead. His next move would be the final one, and the results would be undeniable. As the plane landed, he knew that Skyjet would feel the impact of his quiet decision. It was no longer about him or the flight attendants. It was about making sure that an airline that prided itself on luxury finally understood what true respect meant. Once on the ground, two sharply dressed airline officials were waiting for him. Elijah walked past them without a word. He had already sent the video evidence to Skyjet's CEO, and the request for a full audit was already underway. What the flight attendants didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elijah had set a trap that would expose every subtle form of discrimination that had been overlooked for years. When the cabin crew disembarked, they wouldn't be greeted by the usual routine but by a team of HR officers. No longer would their behaviors go unchecked. No longer would their dismissive attitudes be tolerated. And as they would soon learn, Elijah Williams wasn't someone to be underestimated. As he watched the crew unknowingly move toward the exit, Elijah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't need to say anything to them. He didn't need to make a spectacle. They would soon realize that their behavior had consequences. Consequences they couldn't escape. The transformation had already begun. As the plane touched down in Geneva, Elijah Williams' plan was already in motion. The cabin crew, still unaware of what was coming, went about their usual routine, thinking everything was fine. But the reality was far from that. The minute they stepped off the plane, they were met by HR officers. Their careers were unraveling before their eyes. They had no idea that their actions, small slights of discrimination, dismissive attitudes, and favoritism, had just led to their termination. All because they hadn't recognized the power sitting in seat 1A. The flight attendants who had underestimated Elijah didn't get a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they were quietly escorted away, their employment records frozen, their actions now under review. This wasn't just a firing. It was a statement. One simple act of disrespect had unraveled the system of complacency that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Elijah's message was clear: no one, no matter their status, should ever be treated as less than anyone else. by the time Skyjet's leadership found out, the change was already in motion. It wasn't a loud protest or a public outcry. It was a quiet, calculated strike that left them with no choice but to acknowledge the flaws in their service and culture. Elijah had done more than just hold the crew accountable. He had sparked a shift in the entire company's values, proving that respect and equality are not optional, they are non-negotiable. The crew didn't just lose their jobs. They lost the privilege of thinking they could dismiss anyone. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Untold Stories. Help us continue bringing you powerful stories like this one that inspire real change.